They said they'd reward the cowboy with money. Instead, they gave him an Apache woman as a slave. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The borderland in late autumn was harsh and bare. The earth cracked under hooves, ridges and gullies stretched for miles, and the wind carried dust that cut into the skin. Malcolm Ward sat high in the saddle, his shoulders squared from years of riding, his face darkened by sun and worn by long days alone. At 39, he looked older than his years, the gray at his temples showing against short brown hair. His body was lean, built hard by work, his eyes a storm gray that rarely gave anything away. Malcolm had been a cavalry scout during the war, a job that left him with more memories than pride. He had spent years moving through Apache country with orders in his pocket and men dying around him, and he had learned to track like a hound and to keep quiet. After the war, he didn't have a reason to go back east. He built himself a cabin out near the ridges and stayed there, hunting, raising a horse, doing work for ranchers when they needed someone to ride far and keep his mouth shut. 3 nights earlier, word reached him at a trading post that raiders had taken horses from a nearby Apache camp. He didn't know the band anything, but he knew enough of their loss. A horse meant survival, so he tracked the thieves into the hills. He found them at dawn, 3 men with rifles slung low, their camp a mess of bottles and stolen gear. Malcolm didn't speak. He leveled his rifle, fired once, and the men scattered. He left them alive because he had no wish to carry another death on his shoulders. The horse, thin, scarred at the rope, he tied behind his own mount and started back. By the time he reached the Apache clearing, the sun hung low and red, the smell of smoke heavy in the air. The band noticed him before he was close. Men straightened, their eyes following his every move. Women stopped tending their fires. Children stood still. Malcolm dismounted slow, keeping his posture even, showing no threat. He led the recovered horse forward and dropped the rope before the chief. The chief was tall, hair streaked with gray, his skin cut deep with lines from years under the same sun. His expression was flat, unreadable. He studied Malcolm a long moment, then the horse, then nodded once. Malcolm expected that to be the end. He expected a gesture of thanks, maybe dried meat, maybe a piece of silver if they had it. What came next unsettled him. 2 men shoved forward a young woman. Her wrists were tied with rough rope, her arms bound so tight her shoulders hunched. She was young, maybe 24. Her skin was bronze, her black hair tangled but heavy down her back. Her deerskin dress, decorated once with beads and shells, had been torn across the neckline and split at the hip seam. The damage revealed more of her body than she likely intended. Her collarbone bare, her curves forced into view, the fabric open at her side. She held her chin high, but fear lingered in her eyes. Malcolm's first reaction was confusion, followed by a tight anger in his chest. He didn't understand the chief's words, but he understood the gesture. This woman was meant as payment, a reward, property. He shook his head once, sharp. "No," he said. His voice was low, steady, leaving no doubt. "I don't take people." The men around the fire laughed. To them it was not refusal, it was foolishness. One shoved the woman harder until she stumbled forward. She fell into Malcolm, her shoulder striking his chest. He steadied her by the arm. He felt how thin she was, the bones sharp beneath her skin. She froze under his grip, bracing herself. For a moment, he saw the tension in her eyes. Not just fear, but expectation. She thought he might strike her. He thought of the raids he had seen in the past, the women taken, the children crying, and the soldiers who called it victory. His stomach turned. He pulled his knife free and cut the ropes. They dropped into the dirt. The woman rubbed her wrists quick, wincing at the raw skin. Then she looked up at him, her dark eyes sharp now, searching. She was measuring him, deciding what kind of man he was. He gave no explanation, only a nod toward his horse. "Come on," he said. His tone was firm, not cruel. He knew she might not understand the words, but he hoped she understood his intent. The Apache men stepped back. The chief said nothing. Malcolm mounted, keeping his rifle in sight, and waited. The woman climbed awkwardly onto the bay horse behind, her hands tight on the mane, her body still shaking. He guided both animals east as the sun sank behind the ridge. They rode until the light failed. The land grew cold, the desert wind cutting sharp against their faces. Malcolm stopped at a creek bed, shallow but with enough water to drink. He built a small fire with dry wood. Crouching low, his hand steady though his chest still carried the weight of what had just happened. He didn't want her as property. He didn't want anyone. But if he had left her, she would have been hunted down, punished for nothing. He pulled hard bread from his saddlebag and held it out without a word. She took it with both hands, eating small bites, her eyes locked on him the whole time. He sat across the fire, his revolver within reach, his body angled so he could watch both her and the dark beyond. The fire lit her face in uneven shadows. She had strong features, a steady mouth, eyes that looked older than her years. The dress slipped low at the shoulder, the torn seam exposing her skin. She shifted, pulling it up, her hands quick, her cheeks tightening with discomfort. Malcolm looked away. He had seen women used before. He would not make her think he was the same. He lay back against his saddle, eyes open to the night, listening to the wind and the quiet sound of her chewing. She curled close to the fire, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself. Neither spoke. The silence was heavy, but not unbearable. For Malcolm, it was familiar. For her, it was survival. As the fire settled into embers, Malcolm's thoughts pressed in. He asked himself why he had accepted this burden, why he hadn't just left the horse at the edge of camp and walked away. He didn't know them. He didn't know her. But something in her eyes when she braced for a blow, that same look he had seen 100 times during the war, had struck too deep. He couldn't walk away from it. He shut his eyes then, the rifle still at his side, knowing the road ahead had changed. Whatever she was to him now, she was no longer a reward. She was his responsibility. By morning the fire had gone to ash, the air damp and cold with the weight of dew. Malcolm rose first, the stiffness in his back a reminder of too many nights sleeping on hard ground. He pulled on his coat, checked the rifle where it lay beside him, then turned his eyes to the woman. She was still curled near the dead fire, knees pulled close to her chest, hair tangled over her face. At first glance, she looked younger, more fragile, and for a moment Malcolm wondered if she had slept at all. When she stirred, lifting her head slowly, her eyes were already on him, watchful. She had eaten the bread last night, but he could tell it hadn't been enough. Her cheeks were sharp, her arms thin under the torn deerskin dress. He remembered the horse thieves, men who had been laughing, bottles around their fire, and he thought about what would have happened to her if she had stayed in that camp. He felt the old tension in his chest, the same he carried since the war, the line between duty and survival. He had no orders now, no commanding officer, no reason to bring her with him except the knowledge that leaving her behind would have meant her end. He filled the canteen at the creek, handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then drank, her throat moving fast. The sound was small, but in the silence it felt loud. She passed it back and whispered something in Apache. Malcolm didn't understand, but her tone was softer than before. He gave a short nod, the closest he could offer to an answer. As the horses stamped in the cold, Malcolm thought about his cabin. It wasn't much, 4 walls of pine, a roof patched with tin, a corral, and a stove that smoked if the wind hit wrong. But it was shelter. It was where he kept himself apart from the world. Bringing her there would change that. Yet he saw no other choice. Town was out of the question. If he brought an Apache woman into a place like Santa Fe or Silver City, she would be treated as less than human. Men would spit, some would try to buy her outright, and worse. His cabin was the only place she might not be hounded. They set off as the sun cleared the ridge, pale light washing the land. Malcolm rode ahead, the woman behind on the bay horse. She didn't speak, but her eyes scanned the land in every direction, like she was expecting riders to come out of the gullies. Malcolm noticed the way her hands gripped the horse's mane, tight, ready to hold on. She was used to danger, used to not trusting the quiet. By midday, Malcolm broke the silence. His voice was rough from disuse. Name. He tapped his chest. Malcolm. He kept his eyes ahead, but pointed to her. She looked at him a long moment, then touched her chest lightly. Nieli. The sound of her name was low, steady, carrying weight. Malcolm repeated it once under his breath, not looking back, just to set it in his memory. When they stopped to rest, Nieli crouched by the creek, splashing her face, smoothing her hair back. In the light, he noticed again how torn her dress was. The neckline hung low, ripped too wide across her chest. The seam at her hip was split, showing skin when she shifted. She caught him glance once and pulled the fabric tighter, her jaw tightening. Malcolm looked away quick, his mouth set. He thought of all the questions men might ask if they saw them together. Had he bought her? Had he taken her? He could already hear the assumptions. The truth, that he wanted no part of owning anyone, wouldn't matter to anyone else. He wondered then what her life had been before. Was she from that band? Was she traded? Punished? The Apache did not give away their women without reason. Maybe she had angered someone. Maybe she had no family left. These questions pressed at him, but he didn't ask. He knew enough of silence to recognize it as a shield. As the afternoon wore on, the ridge where his cabin stood came into view, a line of scrub oak marking the slope. The land around it was empty, no neighbors close, no law to interfere. Malcolm slowed the horses, feeling the familiar pull in his chest. This was his place, his one hold on the world, and bringing Nieli here meant it would no longer be his alone. She looked at the cabin as they rode in. Her expression didn't shift much, but her eyes lingered on the corral, the woodpile stacked neat, the smokehouse that leaned at the side. She climbed down from the horse, standing still in the yard, her arms wrapped over her chest, pulling the dress closed. Malcolm watched her scan the place with sharp eyes. He wondered what she thought, that it was poor, that it was lonely, that it was still better than what she had left. He pushed the cabin door open and gestured her inside. She hesitated before stepping through, as if weighing whether it was safer to trust him or the open land behind. Inside, the air was cool, the table bare, the stove unlit. Malcolm set down his gear, lit the fire, and watched as she stood in the doorway, her hands still crossed over herself. He nodded toward the bed in the corner. "You sleep there," he said, his tone even. He laid his own bedroll down by the stove. She glanced at him once, then at the bed, then back at him. Finally, she sat, her body tense, her eyes on him every second. That night, as the fire spread heat through the room, Malcolm sat sharpening his knife, the rasp of stone against steel loud in the stillness. Nieli mended her torn dress with thread from his kit, her fingers moving quick. The seam would never be what it once was, but she worked with care. He caught himself watching her hands, the way she stitched with focus, and then he forced his eyes back to the blade. In his head, he turned over the questions he had left unspoken. Who was she to the Apache who gave her away? Why had they thought she was payment for a horse? Was she meant to be rid of, or meant to be punished? He thought about asking, but her silence told him enough. She wasn't ready to speak of it, and he wasn't ready to hear. When he lay down at last, the fire dim, the cabin quiet except for the crack of wood, he stared at the ceiling beams. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had kept her alive. But as he listened to the sound of her shifting on the bed, he also knew that the days ahead would not let him stay untouched. She wasn't just a stray horse returned to its pen. She was flesh and blood, with eyes that carried more questions than he had answers for. And from now on, she was part of his life, whether he had asked for it or not. The morning inside the cabin was colder than the open night had been. Frost had gathered at the window's edge, a pale outline against the glass, and the smell of smoke from the damp wood clung to the air. Malcolm rose first, setting logs into the stove and forcing the draft open until the fire caught. The warmth spread slow, filling the room with a steady crackle. When he turned, Nieli was awake already, sitting on the bed with her knees drawn close, her eyes moving over the walls, the shelves, every corner of the room. She wasn't resting. She was studying. Malcolm understood why. He had brought her here without explaining, and the silence between them left more questions than answers. If anyone watching had asked, they might have wondered, why had he kept her instead of leaving her behind? Was she his wife now? or just a stranger under his roof? Malcolm knew what the truth was. She was neither, not yet. But he realized he had given her nothing to hold on to, no reason to believe him different from the men who had tied her wrists. He broke the quiet with the only words that made sense. "You're safe here." His voice was low even. Nieli lifted her head, her dark eyes fixed on him, weighing the words. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. He let the silence stand. He wasn't a man who explained himself much, but he knew she needed to see his intent in what he did, not in what he said. After they ate, Malcolm stepped outside to the corral. The sun was pale, the ground still hard with frost, and his breath showed in the air. The bay horse paced restless, still thin, its ribs sharp under the hide. Malcolm ran his hand down its neck, checking for sores, then spread fresh hay by the rail. Neely came out after a while, carrying the bucket without being asked. She set it down near the trough and dipped water for the horse. Her hands were small, her sleeves loose where the dress had torn at the seams, but her movements were steady. It struck Malcolm, then, that she knew her way around animals, that she had done this before. It wasn't just obedience or habit, it was skill. That answered a question he hadn't asked. She hadn't lived her whole life under bonds. She had worked, kept her place, maybe even carried pride in her tasks. Whoever had tied her wrists had stripped her of more than freedom. They had tried to strip her of dignity. By midday, Malcolm put her to work inside. He handed her flour and beans from the sack, showed her where the pot hung over the stove. She didn't need much showing. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had cooked for many before. The smell of beans filled the cabin, richer than anything Malcolm had eaten in weeks. He sat at the table, mending tack, but his eyes kept pulling back to her. The dress was still torn at the neckline, the thread she had used the night before holding, but not strong enough to cover her fully. She tugged at it when it slipped, her jaw tightening, her gaze flicking toward him as if to see if he stared. Malcolm forced his eyes down, his needle steady, but he felt her watching too, testing whether his restraint was real. Later, when he split wood by the stump near the shed, Nieli came to watch. She didn't stand idle. She gathered the pieces as he cut, stacking them near the wall. She was smaller than him, her arms thin, but she didn't falter. Every time he raised the axe, he felt her presence close, silent but certain. It made him think about the questions listeners might have asked if they were here. Why did she trust him enough to work beside him after what she had been through? The answer was in the rhythm of the day itself. He hadn't touched her without need. He hadn't ordered her like property. He had given her tasks, not chains. In that small difference, trust had space to grow. That evening, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Malcolm sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver. Nieli sat across, sewing again at the torn seam of her dress. Her fingers moved quick, her head bent, her braid falling over her shoulder. At one point, the fabric slipped low, showing more of her chest than she intended. She noticed his eyes lift and quickly pulled it back, her cheeks stiff. Malcolm cleared his throat and looked down at the revolver again, jaw tight. The air between them was heavy, not just with discomfort, but with something unspoken. Before turning in, Malcolm finally gave her the words she hadn't heard. "You're not here because I want a slave." He spoke slow, deliberate. "I cut the rope because I wasn't going to leave you like that." She stared at him, her eyes sharp in the firelight, searching for a lie. After a long pause, she gave a single nod, her lips pressed tight, then went back to her sewing. When he lay down that night on his bedroll, the fire low, Malcolm turned over everything in his mind. He had given her his cabin, his food, his silence. But he wondered how long before someone came looking. The men who had stolen horses, the band that had given her away, none of them were far. He thought about the rifle by his side, about the nights to come, and about the quiet weight of the woman in his bed who was no longer just a burden, but a responsibility he had chosen. For the first time in years, he felt the old edge of purpose return. It didn't feel simple, and it didn't feel safe, but it was real. The following days settled into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm strained by silence. Malcolm rose before dawn, feeding the horse, checking the fence line, and splitting wood until his shoulders burned. Nieli took to the cabin chores without being asked. She kept the fire alive, cooked beans or bread, and fetched water from the creek. There was no discussion of roles, no orders exchanged, but a balance formed. Still, questions hung in the air. Why had the Apache chief chosen to give her away? Why had she been the one pushed forward when there were others in the camp? And why did she not try to leave now that she was free of ropes? One morning, as Malcolm brought in a fresh bucket of water, he found her sitting by the table, sewing again at the torn dress. This time she wasn't only repairing but reinforcing it, threading small beads along the neckline, covering where it had ripped. He realized then that she was not only mending clothes, she was reclaiming herself piece by piece. The quiet pride in her hands made sense of something he had wondered. She hadn't fought when she was pushed toward him because fighting would have meant nothing against numbers. Survival had been her only weapon. By stitching the dress, she was drawing a line between what had been done to her and what she chose to carry forward. When the sun reached its height, Malcolm stepped out to check on the tracks he'd seen near the creek 2 days earlier. He crouched in the dirt, tracing the boot prints with his fingers. They weren't his, and they weren't Nieli's moccasins. Someone had passed close. White men, judging by the shape and wear. The prints were not fresh, but they hadn't faded much either. He returned to the cabin with his jaw set tight. Inside, Nieli was crushing beans with a stone, her eyes sharp on him the moment he entered. She knew something weighed on him. He set the rifle against the wall and finally said what had been circling in his head. Men pass near here. Could be the same that took the horses. His tone was even, but she understood the warning. Her lips pressed together, and for the first time since they'd met, she spoke more than a single word. Her English was halting, but clear enough. They come back. The certainty in her voice wasn't guesswork, it was memory. She had seen men like that before, and she knew they didn't let go easy. That night, Malcolm didn't sleep as deep. He sat up long by the fire, rifle across his knees, while Nieli lay on the bed with her back to him. He thought about the questions he hadn't answered for her. She didn't know why he lived alone, why his cabin was so far from town. Listeners might wonder the same. Was he hiding from something or someone? The truth was less dramatic, but heavier. He had seen too much during the war and afterward. Raids, burning villages, bodies left behind. He couldn't stomach living shoulder to shoulder with people who spoke of victory while forgetting the cost. Solitude was his refuge, though he knew it was also a prison he had built for himself. By the third day, the tension of waiting grew sharp. While repairing the corral, Malcolm saw her pause in her work by the water bucket. She was staring up at the ridge, her body stiff. He followed her gaze. 3 riders moved slow along the horizon, their outlines black against the pale sky. They didn't ride down, but their presence was no accident. They were watching. Nieli's face hardened. She muttered in Apache, words he didn't understand but recognized as fear dressed as anger. Her hands gripped the edge of her torn dress, pulling it tighter. Malcolm stepped closer to her, his body between her and the ridge, and spoke with a sharpness he hadn't used before. "If they come down, I'll stand." His voice left no space for doubt. She turned her head toward him, searching his face, testing if he meant it. For a long moment she held his eyes, and then, with a slow exhale, she nodded. It was the first sign she believed he might truly protect her, not because she was his to guard, but because he chose to. That night, the fire threw shifting light across the cabin walls. Malcolm sat at the table, his revolver cleaned and set within reach. Nieli sat on the bed, silent, her hair loose over her shoulders. After a long time, she spoke again, her voice quiet, almost unsteady. "Why me?" The question was simple, but the weight of it pressed hard. Why had she been given away? Why had he taken her instead of turning back? Malcolm stared at the flames, his jaw locked, before answering. "I don't know why they chose you, but I wasn't about to leave you like that." He didn't add more. He didn't tell her about the faces he remembered, women dragged off, children crying in the smoke. He didn't tell her that he carried those memories like iron in his chest, and that letting her be lost would have made him no better than the men he hated. She held his gaze a long moment. Then, for the first time, she lay down without turning her back to him. She faced the fire, her eyes half closed, her breathing slowing. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken but real. Malcolm sat watching until the fire burned low, his hand resting on the revolver, his thoughts heavy. The riders were out there, and they would come back. But for now, in this cabin, in the fragile space built between them, there was a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was a reason to fight when the time came. The next morning the ridge was empty, but the unease hadn't gone with the riders. Malcolm moved through his chores with more caution, his eyes on the horizon as often as on the work in front of him. He fixed the corral gate, replaced the broken rail, and checked the rifle twice before hanging it near the door where his hand could find it in a breath. Neely worked too, carrying water from the creek, stacking wood beside the cabin, her movements quicker than before. She felt the danger as much as he did, and though she said nothing, her silence had a sharper edge now, like she was bracing herself for what was coming. Listeners might have wondered why she didn't just run. The truth revealed itself in the way she looked at the land beyond the cabin. She knew the country, its ridges and gulches, and she knew what lay between here and the next safe place. Days of open ground with no cover, men who would be searching, and the cold that cut deep at night. Leaving alone wasn't survival, it was death. Staying meant risk too, but it was the only risk with a chance. When Malcolm came in at midday, he found her crouched by the stove, stirring beans with the handle of a wooden spoon. She glanced up at him, her eyes steady, then looked back at the pot. He sat at the table, poured water into a tin cup, and spoke low. "You been with that band long?" It was the first time he asked about her past. He had avoided it, but he knew listeners would wonder. She shook her head once, slow, her braid shifting over her shoulder. After a pause, she lifted her eyes and said, "Not my people." Her English was broken but clear. Taken 2 winters ago, Malcolm felt the air tighten in his chest. He had suspected, but hearing it put weight behind the silence she carried. She hadn't been offered to him because she was unwanted by her own. They had never been hers to begin with. She was traded between hands, treated like a thing, until the day she was shoved toward him. His grip tightened on the cup. He wanted to ask more, what had happened to her family, where she had been taken from, but the hard set of her mouth told him enough. The rest was not for him to know, not yet. By late afternoon, the wind cut colder. Malcolm decided it was time to teach her something practical. If riders came again, she needed to know how to use a weapon. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, then came. He showed her how to hold it, how to rest the stock against her shoulder. Her hands were small against the wood, but steady. He corrected her stance with the barest touch of his hand, his voice calm and even. She fired once at a tin can he set on the fence. The shot went wide, but the strength in her jaw told him she wasn't afraid of the recoil. She lowered the rifle and met his eyes. For the first time, there was something like trust in her gaze, not complete but starting. That night, the cabin was warmer than usual. The fire threw a steady light, and Nieli sat close to it, sewing again at the dress. She had patched the hip seam so it no longer split, but the neckline still hung low, impossible to mend fully with the thread she had. The sight of her bare collarbone and the curve of her chest caught Malcolm's eyes more than once, and every time, he forced himself to look away. But she noticed, and instead of pulling the fabric up this time, she let it rest where it was, her hands still moving with the needle. She wasn't offering herself, not in the way men expected. She was testing if he could look at her without trying to take. Malcolm busied his hands by sharpening his knife, the scrape of stone on steel filling the room. His thoughts pressed hard. He wondered if she believed him yet, that he didn't see her as property, that he meant to protect her, not own her. He thought about what people in town would say if they saw them together. They would call her a prize he'd been given, or worse. But he had made his decision the moment he cut her ropes. She was no man's property, not theirs, not his. Before they turned in, she spoke again, her words careful. "Why you alone here?" It was a question she had every right to ask. Listeners might have asked, too. What had kept Malcolm in this lonely cabin when the world moved on without him? He sat still a long moment before answering. I did my years with the cavalry. Saw more than I wanted. Men burned villages, left bodies behind. They called it victory. His voice tightened, but he kept going. I couldn't stay near people after that. So I built this place. He left it at that. He didn't speak of the nights when the memories pressed too close, or the weight of living with no one to share the silence. She studied him with those sharp, dark eyes, then gave the smallest nod. She understood enough. He hadn't chosen solitude because he was weak, but because the world outside had already shown him too much. When the fire dimmed, Malcolm stretched out on his bedroll near the stove, as always. Niele lay on the bed, but this time she didn't turn her back. She lay facing him, her eyes half open, watching him across the shadows. For long while neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like something held in place, fragile but steady, waiting for what came next. Outside, the land stayed quiet, but Malcolm knew the riders hadn't forgotten. And now, if they came again, it would not be just his fight. It would be theirs, together. The days after the riders showed themselves were long and tense. Malcolm rose earlier than usual, sometimes before the light reached the ridge, moving through chores with his rifle always near. He checked the fence lines again and again, as though wood rails could keep out the kind of men who had been watching from the horizon. Niele noticed the change in him, his eyes sharper, his movements quicker, his silence heavier. She adapted without complaint, staying close to the cabin and working with more urgency than before. The listeners might have wondered why no one from town had shown up yet. Neighbors, lawmen, anyone who could have helped. The truth was Malcolm had built his cabin far enough out that the nearest settlement was 2 days' ride, and he had chosen it that way. He wanted no sheriff on his land, no neighbor with questions. That meant when trouble came, there was no one to call. It was his burden to carry, and now hers too. One morning, Malcolm caught her looking at the horizon again. She stood near the corral, the bucket still in her hands, her body stiff. "They don't stop," she said suddenly, her words thick with accent, but clear enough. "Men like that, they keep coming." It was more than fear, it was knowledge. She had lived it. Malcolm set down the saddle he was repairing and came closer. "I know," he said. He didn't lie to soften it. She deserved truth, not comfort. Later that day, while chopping wood, Malcolm noticed her lingering nearby. She wasn't gathering wood this time. She was watching him, her hands clasped at her sides, her eyes measuring. Finally, she asked, her voice quiet, "Why you fight for me?" It was a question that had hung unspoken since the day he cut her ropes. He paused with the axe in his hand, sweat running down his temple, and answered plain, "Because I couldn't stand by and watch again." He didn't explain the memories that drove the words, burned villages, women bound, soldiers who laughed. But his tone carried the weight of it, and she seemed to hear it. That night, they sat across from each other at the table. Niele had cooked beans again, this time adding wild herbs she had gathered near the creek. The taste surprised Malcolm, sharper and fresher than what he was used to. He looked at her while eating, and for the first time, he felt something shift, gratitude not just for the food, but for her presence. He hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years. She noticed his gaze and didn't look away. Her dress still bore the scars of rough handling, the neckline too low where the fabric refused to hold. But instead of pulling it closed, she kept her hands steady on the table. It wasn't an invitation. It was defiance. She wanted him to see her as she chose to be, not as a prize broken by men. Malcolm leaned back his chair, tired but alert, the revolver on the table near his hand. "If they come back," he said, steady, "I don't want you just waiting inside. You'll take the rifle." She tilted her head, searching his face, testing his resolve. Then she nodded once. Her silence wasn't refusal, it was agreement. She was no longer content to hide. When they lay down that night, the distance between them was less than before. She rested on the bed, her face turned toward him, eyes half closed. He lay on the floor near the stove, but his gaze drifted to her more often than he admitted. The firelight caught the edges of her hair, the curve of her cheek, the steady rise and fall of her chest. He told himself to close his eyes, but he didn't, not right away. He was watching, not out of desire alone, but because for the first time in years he felt he was guarding someone worth more than his own solitude. And though the land outside held danger, though the riders would return, there was no mistaking the truth in that cabin now. Malcolm and Nieli were not two strangers tied by chance anymore. They were becoming something else, two people bound by choice, by silence, and by the decision to face what was coming together. The ridge stayed quiet for 2 more days, but silence on the frontier never meant safety. Malcolm's nerves were wound tight. Every time he stepped out of the cabin, his eyes scanned the horizon, and every creak of the wood at night made his hand reach for the revolver beside his bedroll. Nieli felt it too. She spoke less, but her body language was sharp with awareness. She listened for hoofbeats when she fetched water, and when she cooked, she kept glancing toward the door. The threat of the riders had become part of their lives, unspoken but constant. One morning, as the frost burned off the ground, Malcolm spotted fresh tracks at the creek bed. Hoofprints, 3 horses, maybe 4, passing close but not stopping. He crouched, studying the depth of the prints, and muttered to himself, "They're circling." When he returned to the cabin, Nieli was standing at the doorway, waiting. She had seen the look on his face before he spoke. "They come soon," she said flatly. Not a question, but a certainty. Listeners might have wondered at this point why Malcolm didn't just pack up, take her, and leave the cabin behind. The truth was simple. Running wasn't safer. The country was wide and exposed, with nowhere to hide for miles. His cabin, for all its weakness, gave them walls, fire, and a defensible position. And for Malcolm, abandoning the cabin meant abandoning the last piece of himself he had built after the war. He wasn't ready to give that up. Not now. That afternoon, he taught Nieli more with the rifle. This time he didn't just show her how to hold it. He let her fire again, correcting her aim, his hands firm on her shoulders. She didn't flinch at the recoil, though the shot still went wide. He could see determination in her face, a stubbornness that reminded him she hadn't survived by accident. She was sharper, tougher than he had guessed at first. By the third shot, she hit the fence rail. The satisfaction in her eyes was small but real. For Malcolm, it was a reminder that if things turned bloody, she wouldn't be helpless. When the sun dropped, they brought everything inside, water buckets, extra wood, tools, and barred the cabin door. Malcolm laid his rifle across the table, revolver on his hip, knife within reach. Nieli kept busy sewing the last of the thread into her dress, though the fabric still left her collarbone and curves more exposed than she likely wanted. Malcolm noticed, but this time, when her eyes met his, she didn't pull the fabric closed. She let it rest where it was, her chin lifted as if daring him to see her without shame. His throat tightened, but he looked back at her with steady eyes. She needed respect more than pity, and he gave it. Night deepened. The fire flickered, shadows stretching across the walls. Malcolm sat near the door, rifle in hand, his eyes on the dark beyond the window. Nieli lay on the bed, but didn't turn away from him. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "You were not like others." Malcolm's jaw tightened at her words, because he knew what she meant. Other men would have used her by now, would have treated her like the thing she had been handed over as. He didn't answer right away, but after a pause he said, "No, I've seen enough of what men do. I won't be part of it." His voice was rough, the honesty sitting heavy in his chest. She watched him long after, her eyes softening in a way he hadn't seen before. Slowly, she shifted under the quilt, her body turning toward him, her face half lit by the fire. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't fear either. It was a choice to face him, not the wall. Malcolm felt something stir in him he hadn't allowed in years. A pull toward closeness, toward trust. Just before sleep took them, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted faintly through the night air. Malcolm stiffened, hand tightening on the rifle, but the sound faded. He didn't move, listening until the silence settled again. He looked back at Nieli. Her eyes were open still, watching him. He gave a small nod, more to himself than her. "Tomorrow," he muttered. She understood. The storm wasn't far off, and as the fire burned low, the truth was clear. They weren't strangers sharing space anymore. They were two people bound by survival and choice, preparing to stand side by side when the riders finally came down from the ridge. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a heavy quiet, the kind that pressed down on both of them. Malcolm had barely slept. Every creak of the boards, every shift of the wind outside, made him sit up, half awake, hand brushing the stock of his rifle. Nieli had watched him from the bed more than once during the night, her dark eyes open in the faint firelight, as though she too knew they were at the edge of something that could not be turned away from. At dawn, he stepped outside, the cold biting at his face. The ridge was still, the trees thin and bare, but the ground told the truth. Hoofprints were fresh in the dirt, leading down into the wash. At least 3 riders, maybe more, circling again. He crouched, running his fingers along the marks, his jaw tightening. They hadn't left. They were waiting, watching. When he came back to the cabin, Nieli was already awake, kneeling by the stove. She had lit the fire and stirred beans in the pot with a wooden spoon. She looked up at him as he stepped inside. He didn't need to speak. His expression told her enough. She set the spoon down and stood, her hands at her sides. "Today?" she asked in her halting English. "Could be," Malcolm answered, his voice flat. He didn't want to frighten her, but he also wouldn't lie. She nodded once, her face unreadable, but he saw her hands tighten into fists before she went back to the stove. Listeners might have wondered, why hadn't Malcolm considered going into town to warn the sheriff or bring back help? The answer was simple but sharp. The nearest town was too far, at least 2 days' ride. He would never leave her here alone, and taking her with him meant risking her life in the open. Town wasn't safety for her anyway. The moment people saw an Apache woman at his side, she'd be treated like a criminal or worse. If there was going to be a stand, it had to be here. By midday, Malcolm prepared openly. He cleaned the rifle again, laid spare cartridges on the table, and checked the revolver twice. Nieli watched him with sharp eyes, no longer flinching at the sight of the weapons. Instead, she walked to the table, picked up one of the cartridges, and turned it in her hand before setting it down. It wasn't curiosity, it was acceptance. She understood what was coming. After the meal, he took her outside with the rifle again. The wind was bitter, cutting across the ridge, but she didn't complain. He set up 3 tin cans on the fence, showed her how to steady her breath. She lifted the rifle, her arms tense but steady, and fired. The first shot went wide. The second knocked a can into the dirt. She lowered the weapon, her lips tightening with something close to pride. Malcolm gave a short nod. Better. It was the first time he allowed a hint of approval in his tone, and she caught it. A faint spark lit her eyes, though she said nothing. When they returned inside, the air between them carried something heavier than fear. They both knew what the night might bring. Nieli sat on the bed, sewing again at her dress, pulling the neckline tighter, though it still bared more than she likely wished. The torn fabric had become a symbol. Malcolm realized it now. It was the mark of what had been done to her. In her constant work to mend, it was her way of refusing to stay broken. As the sun dropped low, Malcolm moved the table against the door, then stacked firewood within arm's reach. He explained in few words how she should move if the riders broke through. Stay low, take the rifle, aim steady. She listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she asked one question. "You not leave me?" The words were soft but carried the weight of all her silence. Malcolm froze, the question cutting deep. He turned to her, his jaw tight, and shook his head once. "No," he said, "I won't." His voice carried no hesitation, and she believed him. Something eased in her shoulders then, a small release of the tension she had carried for days. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire, closer than before. Malcolm leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the rifle across his lap. Nieli moved nearer, the quilt around her shoulders, her eyes on the flames. After a long silence, she reached out and laid her hand lightly on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him without hesitation. He turned his head, met her gaze, and saw no fear there. Just trust, fragile but real. For a moment, he let himself feel it, the warmth of her hand, the quiet promise in her eyes. He reached up, covered her hand with his rough one, and held it there. No words passed between them, but the silence spoke louder than anything could. It wasn't possession. It wasn't pity. It was a choice made in the face of danger to stand together. That night, as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with shadows, Malcolm stayed awake, his back against the wall, rifle close. Nieli lay on the bed, her face turned toward him, eyes closing slowly in trust she hadn't given to anyone in years. Outside, the wind carried faint sounds across the ridge. Malcolm listened, every muscle tense, knowing the riders would come soon. But he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The cabin was no longer just his refuge. It was theirs, and whatever came down from the ridge, they would face it together. The night broke with the sound of hooves. Malcolm had been sitting by the stove, his back against the wall, rifle across his knees, when the faint rhythm reached him. He stood in an instant, moved to the window, and looked out through the small crack in the shutters. The moon was thin, but the pale light carried far enough. Shapes moved on the ridge, 3, maybe 4 men on horseback, slow and deliberate. They weren't passing by this time. They were coming down. Nieli stirred on the bed, pulling herself upright, eyes wide and fixed on him. "Now," she whispered, her voice low but steady. Malcolm gave a short nod, jaw tight. He crossed to the table where the cartridges were laid out, sliding them into his pocket with practiced motions. He pressed the rifle into her hands. "You remember what I showed you?" he asked. She nodded once, her face hard. She checked the rifle as he had taught her, her hands trembling only for a moment before steadying. Listeners might have wondered what Malcolm was really prepared to do. He wasn't a lawman anymore, and he had lived years in solitude to keep away from killing. But there was no choice here. If he stood down, they would take Nieli, maybe burn the cabin, maybe kill them both. The truth was Malcolm had always lived between violence and restraint. But this was different. This wasn't orders from a colonel or revenge for lost comrades. This was his choice, and he knew what it meant. The first rider came into the yard as the wind rattled the shutters. A voice called out, low and mocking, "Ward, we know what you're keeping. Send her out, and we'll leave you be." Malcolm's grip tightened on the revolver at his hip. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped to the door and spoke through it, his voice calm but edged with iron. "She's not yours. You want her, you'll have to come through me." Silence followed, then laughter, cold, ugly. Gunfire cracked the air, a bullet splintering the wood near the window. Nieli flinched but didn't scream. She crouched low near the bed, rifle in hand, her eyes fixed on the door. Malcolm dropped to one knee, aimed through the gap in the shutter, and fired once. A shadow tumbled from the saddle. The horse screamed and bolted. The others shouted, cursing. The fight stretched in bursts of sound and silence. More shots tore into the cabin walls, filling the room with dust and smoke. Nieli fired once through the gap, the recoil hard against her shoulder, and a shout outside told them she hadn't missed entirely. Malcolm fired again, calm, deliberate, each shot meant. He had fought enough to know panic wasted bullets. After a long stretch, the hoofbeats pulled back, fading into the ridge. The yard was still. Malcolm stayed crouched, waiting, breath held. Nieli's eyes searched his face, looking for his decision. "They go?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not far. They'll think again before they come close." For the rest of the night, they didn't sleep. Malcolm kept watch by the door, rifle across his knees, while Nieli sat close to the fire, eyes open, hands still tight around the weapon. The hours dragged, the silence broken only by the pop of the stove and the distant cry of coyotes. But the riders did not return. When dawn broke, the yard was empty except for the marks of hooves and the body of the man who hadn't risen. Malcolm buried him near the creek without a word. Nieli watched from a distance, her face unreadable, but when he returned, her hand touched his arm lightly. It wasn't thanks in words. She hadn't given those yet, but the gesture was enough. Listeners might have wondered if they would pack up and leave after such a night. But Malcolm didn't. He had built this cabin with his own hands, and walking away would mean giving it to the kind of men he had always despised. More than that, Nieli had nowhere else to go. She had been pushed from one place to another, treated like property, discarded when convenient. Leaving would make her a fugitive again. Staying gave her something she had never been offered: permanence. Over the following days, the quiet returned. They repaired the walls where bullets had split the wood. Malcolm cut new rails for the corral, while Nieli washed blood from the floorboards, her movements steady, her expression calm. At night, they shared meals at the table, and though the tension lingered in the air, it was no longer fear, it was relief. They had stood, and they were still standing. One evening, as the fire warmed the cabin and the wind rattled softly outside, Nieli set aside her sewing and looked at Malcolm. She spoke slow, her English broken but clear. No slave, no trade, family. The words came out firm, not a question, but a declaration. Malcolm looked at her across the fire, his chest tightening. For years, he had lived alone, convincing himself that solitude was strength. But in that moment, he realized what had been missing. He nodded, his voice low but certain. Family. She moved then, sitting closer, her hand resting against his chest, her eyes steady on his. The space between them closed not with words, but with choice. He leaned in, their foreheads touching, their breaths mingling. It wasn't hunger or possession. It was belonging, quiet and certain. By spring, the land began to thaw, and green pushed up through the earth again. The cabin stood, scarred but stronger for what it had endured. Malcolm and Nieli worked side by side, tending the horse, mending the fence, planting what seeds they had. The danger had passed, at least for now. What remained was the home they had chosen to build together. The story that had begun with ropes and silence ended with a truth neither of them had expected. They were not bound by ownership or by fear, but by the will to stay. And for Malcolm Ward and Nieli, staying was the clearest kind of love the frontier could ever offer.